Canada's population is aging. In fact, according to Stats Canada, in the summer of 2015, for the first time ever, there were more Canadian seniors than those under the age of 15. Now, the question is, are we adequately prepared for some of the challenges that come with an aging population? To talk more about it, we're joined by Taylor Jackson, an independent researcher and a former senior policy analyst with the Fraser Institute, who is one of the co-authors of a Fraser Institute report entitled Canada's Aging Population and Implications for Canadian Finances. Welcome to the show, Taylor.
Thank you for having me.
Taylor, we aren't getting any younger, are we? There are quite a few baby boomers out there.
No, there are. And if we look at Statistics Canada's projections of how Canada's population is going to age, they project from 2010 to 2063, we're going to see or go from 15% of the population being seniors to over 25% of the population being over the age of 65. So we're going to get to a point here where 1/4 of Canadians are going to be senior citizens. And this, of course, is going to lead to higher demands for programs like healthcare, like old age transfer programs, old age security, the guaranteed income supplement, and programs of the like. So governments are going to have to prepare for these higher spending demands that are on their way.
You know, something as well I was just thinking about too is, as a baby boomer, or even myself at my age, not a baby boomer, I don't like the two stories. 17 steps up, 18 steps down. So there's going to be an influx or a flood of a big flood of the market of all these two stories. Everybody wants a one story or a bungalow.
Yes, no, certainly. And there could be some other effects in that sense.
Yeah. Now, what are some of the other implications of an aging population? Will it create maybe some labor shortage problems?
Well, yes. So the one problem that we talked about is spending. Now, the other problem is actually going to be for government revenue. So as Canadians age, they're going to retire, they're going to leave the labor force, and we're going to see a situation where the share of the Canadian population actually in the labor force is going to be relatively smaller. And most economists expect that this is going to have a negative impact on economic growth, but also have a negative impact on government revenue growth. So you're going to have a situation where government spending is going to be increasing, revenue growth is going to be increasing at a much slower rate, and this could lead to some serious fiscal imbalances for Canadian governments.
So how much more money will be required to care for some of these seniors, maybe 20 or 30 years from now, to cover off healthcare and pensions?
Well, if you look at healthcare spending, by 2045, our projections are that we're going to see healthcare spending increase by about 57%. Now, on the old age transfer side, that program, again, by 2045 is expected to increase about 47%. Now, to put that in context, if you saw those increases in 2016, it would have been an additional $107 billion of government spending. So it's quite a large amount of money that's going to be on its way.
So where will the government get a lot of the money from? The taxpayers?
Well, this is the question governments are going to have to ask. So one option is going to be reform programs, try and do them in a more cost-effective manner and keep delivering the services that Canadians are going to demand. Another option could be increasing taxes. Another option could be increasing economic growth, which would help with government revenue growth. Then there's also financing these spending or this increased spending with increased deficits, which will lead to debt. Now, it could be some combination of those different things the government could do, but they have to start recognizing that this problem is on its way and start planning accordingly.
So, Taylor, realistically, can you see any future governments making significant cutbacks to healthcare?
Well, we've seen healthcare spending continually rise, and this is a provincial matter. So the provinces are going to have to look at their somewhat different healthcare programs. First, recognize that more spending is on the way as demands are going to increase, and look to different ways to perhaps gain some cost efficiencies in those systems.
Okay, what about pensions federally? What are we looking
pensions,
at there?
yes, it's a federal matter, and we've actually seen the federal government move the opposite direction on pensions. So you look at old age security, the federal government has actually lowered the age of eligibility for old age security payouts to 65 after the previous government had increased it to 67. Now, this is moving in the opposite direction of where most countries are moving internationally, and it's only going to increase the pressure that's going to be pushed on this program as benefits are now handed out at an earlier age.
Could you see maybe some policy being created or having it pushed back to 67 again in the future?
It's
and
quite
we're seeing
possible.
that in other countries as well.
We certainly have. We have seen it in Canada as well. So
Yeah.
as spending increases, as the population gets older, governments might have to make a choice to move it back to 67. They might have to do it in a quicker time period where it was going to be more phased in previously.
So this kind of financial pressure on future governments seems really unsustainable. Could this force Canada to actually give up our current public health system and maybe switch to kind of a hybrid public and private healthcare system?
Well, it's tough to say what it's going to mean for Canada's healthcare system specifically. Again, the provinces, and this really is their jurisdiction, are going to have to take a hard look at their system and possibly get creative with different ways to do things. Now, that could be broader reform, moving towards more universal healthcare systems like they have in Europe, which aren't necessarily single payer based. But it is tough to say what exactly governments are going to do in terms of how they're going to manage this increased spending in the area of healthcare.
Now, here's an idea to help with the aging population, and especially with workers retiring. The Liberals, the federal Liberals, are thinking of bringing in a lot more refugees, over 300,000 over the next 5 years. Will that maybe help offset things a little bit with our population problem, being younger?
It could to some extent, particularly if you look at the effect it could have on labor force participation, higher levels of economic growth and the like. But it is still expected that even with higher levels of immigration, we are going to see a wave of spending coming from the aging population, and that additional spending will likely outpace any sort of gains that we would be expected to get from greater immigration at this time.
So what are some of the real issues you see potentially with the immigration? You know, opening up the floodgates and opening up the borders and letting a lot of people coming in. And because I know a lot of immigrants that I've spoken with specifically, they may be doctors in their native homeland. They come to Canada and they can't get a job as a doctor. You know, they end up driving a cab or something. Are those some of the challenges that maybe would prohibit people who are more than qualified coming into our country?
Well, it's really tough to say, and I can't say too much about the specifics of the immigration system. That's well beyond the scope of what our study looked at. Again, our study was really about trying to get governments to recognize that this increased wave of spending is going to be on its way. We didn't go too much into solutions, as these are going to be quite complex and require governments to, again, get creative. And it's going to be all levels of governments that are going to have to try and address these problems.
Now, some countries have actually provided financial incentives to citizens to have more kids. You know, the average Canadian family, what, two and a half kids? Although some people here at work, they have 10 and 12 siblings here in Lethbridge, Alberta. Maybe how about some financial incentives? What are your thoughts?
Well, again, I don't think it's going to come down to sort of one thing that's going to help deal with this wave of spending. You know, it's not just going to be increased immigration or possible financial incentives for more children to thus increase the labor force participation rate. It really is going to be a sort of system-wide look that governments are going to have to take. I mean, it's going to be quite a large increase in spending. It's going to be quite a large increase in the areas of healthcare and senior transfer programs. And it's not just going to be one thing that's going to help. Certain things might help more than others. But again, that's really beyond the scope of our paper. For us, the first thing that governments have to do is recognize the problem.
And you know, if somebody is an entrepreneur, maybe they should consider some potential business venture that would really help a lot of the baby boomers, because you'll have quite the clientele. Taylor Jackson, an independent researcher and a former senior policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Yes, thank you for having me on.